Look into my eyes and you see I'm the only one.
This is the Freddie Mercury song that refuses to explain itself. No grand chorus, no stadium chant, no dramatic confession spelled out for the world, just a fragile melody and a silence that feels intentional. Most Queen songs demand attention. This one asks for restraint. Hidden deep inside Queen's catalog is You Take My Breath Away, a song so exposed, so stripped back, that it almost feels unfinished. Fans often skip it. Critics rarely analyze it. And Freddie Mercury never told the world what it was really about. But someone understood. While listeners focus on what's being sung, Brian May understood what wasn't. He knew why the arrangement was barely there, why the guitar almost disappears, why the song feels like it's holding its breath instead of releasing it. This isn't a story about hidden lyrics or secret dedications. It's about a decision made in the studio, a choice to not play, not decorate, not interfere. Because sometimes the deepest meaning of a song isn't in the notes you hear. It's in the ones deliberately left out. And that's why this Freddie Mercury song remains a secret understood by only one person who was there when silence became the message. Before we continue, if you love the stories of Freddie Mercury and Queen and want to help keep his legacy alive, subscribe to this channel, like, and share. Freddie Mercury was rarely unguarded. On stage, he was theatrical, commanding, almost untouchable. Even in the studio, his writing often wrapped emotion in metaphor, drama, and character. Vulnerability was usually dressed in spectacle. But You Take My Breath Away breaks that pattern. There's no alter ego here, no operatic flourish, no clever disguise. The lyrics arrive quietly, almost apologetically, as if Freddie wasn't sure he wanted anyone listening too closely. That alone makes the song unusual. It doesn't try to impress, it doesn't reach outward, it turns inward and stays there. The phrasing is gentle, the melody barely rises. Every line feels like it could collapse if pushed too hard. For a man known for excess, this kind of restraint is startling. And that's why the song feels uncomfortable to some listeners. It asks you to sit with something unresolved. It doesn't offer release. It doesn't explain itself. It just exists. Freddie never clarified the meaning. No interviews, no dedication, no context handed to the public. The song was allowed to stand on its own, fragile and exposed. That wasn't accidental. It was a rare moment where Freddie removed the mask completely and trusted that someone in the room would understand what to do next. Queen was famous for layering sound, massive harmonies, stacked guitars, carefully built walls of music. That was the band's signature, and Brian May was a master architect of it, which makes the arrangement of You Take My Breath Away almost shocking. There's barely anything there. No soaring guitar lines, no dramatic counter melodies, just enough structure to keep the song standing and no more. For Queen, that level of restraint was not normal. It was risky. The song could have been filled out. It could have been polished into something safer, something more recognizably Queen, but that didn't happen. Instead, the arrangement steps back. This is where Brian's understanding becomes crucial. Any guitarist could have added more. Any producer could have suggested enhancement. Brian chose the opposite. He recognized that the song wasn't asking to be completed, it was asking to be protected. Protection meant silence. By doing less, Brian allowed Freddie's vulnerability to remain intact. The empty spaces weren't flaws, they were boundaries. Cross them, and the song would lose its purpose. Most listeners hear simplicity. Brian heard a warning, "Don't touch this." And obeying that warning took more discipline than playing ever would. For a guitarist like Brian May, silence is not a default setting. His instinct has always been to respond, to build, to answer, to lift a song higher. Choosing not to do that goes against everything he was known for. And yet, with You Take My Breath Away, he stepped back. Not because he had nothing to add, but because he understood that adding anything would change what the song was trying to say. This wasn't technical understanding, it was emotional recognition. Brian knew the difference between a song that needs support and one that needs space. He sensed that Freddie wasn't performing here, he was exposing something unfinished, unresolved, and deeply personal. Filling that space would have turned confession into performance. So Brian listened. He allowed the pauses to breathe. He let the melody stand alone. And in doing so, he made one of the most important creative decisions of his career, one that most people will never notice. That's the secret. The song isn't powerful because of what Brian played. It's powerful because of what he didn't. And that kind of understanding doesn't come from reading lyrics. It comes from being there and knowing when silence is the only honest response. Freddie Mercury was famous for refusing to explain himself. He believed songs should live on their own, without footnotes or confessions attached. But with "You Take My Breath Away," that silence feels heavier than usual. There was no story offered to the press. No hint dropped in interviews. No playful deflection. Just distance. That absence invited speculation, but it also set a boundary. Whatever inspired the song, Freddie chose not to turn it into a public narrative. And that decision alone tells us something important. This wasn't a message meant for everyone. Inside the studio, though, context existed. Brian was there as the song took shape. He heard the hesitations. He noticed how carefully Freddie handled each line, how easily the song could collapse under pressure. This wasn't Freddie performing vulnerability, it was Freddie navigating it in real time. And Brian understood that asking questions might break something fragile. So he didn't. The song remained undefined, floating between meaning and mystery. For listeners, it's open-ended. For Brian, it's anchored to a moment, one that never needed words. That's why explanations would have ruined it. Naming the feeling would have shrunk it. And that's why the song still feels like it's waiting, not to be decoded, but to be respected. Most Queen songs announce themselves. They explode. They demand participation. They invite crowds to sing along. "You Take My Breath Away" does the opposite. It asks for quiet, and that makes people uneasy. There's no obvious climax. No triumphant release. No emotional instruction manual. For many listeners, that feels unsatisfying. So the song gets skipped, not because it's weak, but because it's exposed. It doesn't perform strength. It reveals restraint. And restraint is easy to misunderstand. Fans often gravitate toward the moments where Freddie feels invincible. This song shows him uncertain, suspended, almost unfinished. That version of Freddie doesn't fit the legend people expect. And that's exactly why it matters. The song isn't meant to be shouted in arenas. It's meant to be heard alone, in a quiet space, without distraction. It's a private conversation that accidentally became public. Brian understood that from the start. He never pushed the song forward in live settings, never reframed it, never tried to elevate it into something bigger than it was. He let it remain small because small was honest. And honesty doesn't always attract applause. At its core, "You Take My Breath Away" exists because of trust. Not the kind built through speeches or reassurance, but the quiet kind, formed in moments where no one needs to say anything out loud. Freddie trusted that someone in the room would understand what this song was asking for, and more importantly, what it was asking to be spared from. This wasn't a song that wanted correction. It wasn't looking for expansion. It didn't need to be made bigger. Freddie trusted Brian to recognize that. For most musicians, silence feels like an unfinished thought, an open space waiting to be filled. But Brian sensed that filling it would change the meaning entirely. Adding more sound wouldn't enhance the emotion, it would interrupt it. So he held back. That decision required discipline. It meant resisting instinct. It meant allowing vulnerability to exist without protection. And in a band known for power and precision, that kind of restraint was radical. This wasn't about ego or hierarchy. It was about respect. Freddie trusted Brian not to interfere. Brian trusted Freddie's instinct enough to step aside. In that exchange, something rare happened. A song was allowed to remain exactly as fragile as it was born. That's why this track feels so exposed even decades later. It was never reinforced, never armored, never hidden behind spectacle. Most listeners hear a quiet Queen song. Brian hears a moment when doing nothing was the most meaningful contribution he could make. And that kind of understanding can't be taught, it can only be lived. Releasing "You Take My Breath Away" was a quiet risk. Not the kind that creates headlines, but the kind that unsettles a band from the inside. Queen was known for precision, confidence, and control. This song offered none of that. It didn't assert itself. It didn't compete. It simply existed fragile and unresolved. And that can be dangerous. Songs like this invite misunderstanding. They can be dismissed as incomplete, overlooked as minor, or quietly ignored. There's no immediate reward for the listener, no obvious hook, no clear emotional payoff. But Freddie allowed that risk to stand. He didn't rework the song to make it safer. He didn't hide it behind clever production. He trusted that its stillness was the point, even if most people wouldn't recognize it. Brian understood the gamble. He knew the song wasn't designed to succeed by normal standards. It wasn't trying to win over a crowd, it was trying to remain honest. And honesty doesn't always survive exposure. That's why letting the song breathe mattered so much. Any attempt to control it would have stripped away its purpose. The pauses weren't empty, they were carrying weight. The softness wasn't weakness, it was intention. Queen didn't often allow themselves this kind of vulnerability, and when they did, they didn't advertise it. They let the song take the risk alone. Most listeners experience a song from the outside. They hear what's presented, they react to melody, mood, and surface emotion. With You Take My Breath Away, that experience remains incomplete because the song's meaning isn't fully contained in what you hear. Brian understands it differently. Not because he deciphered the lyrics, but because he witnessed the choices that shaped them. He knows what was considered and deliberately removed. He remembers the moments where adding more felt tempting and why it would have been wrong. That knowledge doesn't come from analysis. It comes from proximity. Brian doesn't just hear the song, he hears the restraint behind it, the hesitation, the decision to stop before crossing a line. He understands how close the song came to becoming something else entirely. That's the truth behind it. Listeners connect to the emotion. Brian connects to the process and the reason that process stopped exactly where it did. He knows why the song feels suspended instead of resolved. And that's why he never tried to redefine it later. Never reframed it in performances. Never explained it publicly. Because explanation would turn understanding into interpretation. And this song was never meant to be interpreted loudly. Over time, You Take My Breath Away has remained quietly untouched. It hasn't been reclaimed as a fan favorite. It hasn't been recontextualized or given a second life through spectacle. It exists where it was left suspended, intimate, and unresolved. That's not an accident. The song doesn't ask for attention, it waits. And only those willing to sit with it long enough begin to sense what it's really doing. It's not telling a story, it's holding one. For Freddie, that restraint may have been the only way to express something without turning it into performance. For Brian, it became a responsibility to let the song remain exactly as it was born. That's why this track feels different from the rest of Queen's catalog. It doesn't reach outward, it folds inward. It doesn't demand understanding, it resists it. And that resistance is the point. The song isn't unfinished because something is missing. It's unfinished because finishing it would have betrayed its truth. Most people hear a gentle Queen ballad. Brian hears a moment that was never meant to be explained, only protected. And that's why this Freddie Mercury song remains a secret, even when it's been playing in front of us all along. There's a difference between hearing a song and understanding it. Most people hear You Take My Breath Away as a quiet moment in Queen's catalog, a pause between larger statements, something gentle, maybe even forgettable. But that reaction proves the point. This song was never designed to announce itself. Understanding it requires slowing down, sitting with the silence, accepting that not every emotion arrives fully formed or clearly explained. Freddie didn't shape this song to be decoded, he shaped it to remain open. Brian understood that from the beginning. He knew that the power of the song wasn't hidden in clever wordplay or musical complexity. It was hidden in restraint, in knowing when to stop, in recognizing that some truths collapse when you try to pin them down. That's why the song still feels suspended in time. It hasn't aged because it never resolved itself. It doesn't belong to a specific era or sound. It exists in a space that feels personal, almost private. For Brian, understanding meant remembering what the song almost became and why it couldn't go there. He remembers the instinct to add more and the discipline it took not to. That kind of understanding doesn't come from listening harder. It comes from being there when silence made sense. Some songs invite analysis. Some demand explanation. And some quietly resist both. You Take My Breath Away belongs to the last category. It isn't a riddle waiting to be solved or a confession meant for the public. It's a moment preserved exactly as it happened, fragile, incomplete, and honest. Freddie didn't protect it with spectacle. Brian didn't shield it with sound. Together, they allowed it to exist without armor. That's why the song still feels so close. Understanding it isn't about knowing who it was written for or what every line means. It's about recognizing the courage it took to leave something unfinished and trusting that the silence would speak for itself. Brian understood that silence because he lived inside it. And maybe that's the real secret. Not that this song has a hidden meaning, but that it refuses to be owned by anyone who wasn't there when it was allowed to breathe. If this made you hear the song differently, even just once, take a moment and let me know in the comments. Did this song ever stand out to you before? Or did you only notice it now? If you enjoy stories that uncover the quiet moments behind legendary music, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and join us for the next hidden chapter, because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that almost disappear.